Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of Jams Tea Podcast, where we spin the jams and spill the tea. And this week, we're coming at you with a new-ish kind of video, because normally in these episodes, we do now topics where we cover a specific theme that we all pitch in on, and then we talk about news and all that. However, this year has really kicked into gear very recently. So what we're doing today is doing a huge marathon series of reviews of notable albums that have released in the last couple of weeks that we thought were worth talking about.
Yeah, we thought it would be fun to do a quick fire review format just because we don't really challenge ourselves to be that succinct all that often. And also just the fact that if you're keenly following the channel, you might have noticed that we haven't done a new reviews video, aside from the most recent one that would have just come out, but we hadn't done a new reviews video for several weeks. So we thought, let's play catch up. Let's talk about the albums we never got to review and some other ones that we found interesting as well. And let's kind of try and keep the variety nice and widespread, right? In terms of genres that we're covering, and indeed in terms of the level to which we enjoy these albums in the first place. So first off today, we're going to kick off with a big highlight of the week for both of us. McKinley Dixon's new album, Beloved Paradise Jazz?
Jazz?
Like jazz? This was heavily anticipated because if you've been paying close attention to our Jams and Tea Now segments where Jake has talked about the music that he's been really into recently, you will have known that Jake is a huge fan of McKinley Dixon's last album, For My Mama and Anyone Who Looked Like Her. For anyone who doesn't know, McKinley Dixon operates within, I suppose you could call it, the jazz rap realm. Certainly someone who is on the more sort of modern side of what would constitute abstract hip hop, someone who is very colorful, very technically powerful performer, but also like composes these rich and dense soundscapes that he uses to as a bedrock for his dense tapestries, waxing lyrical on various different cultural themes and experiences of blackness in America in his life and within his particular culture. So, you know, as obviously expert as we are on those topics, we nevertheless want to talk about the new McKinley Dixon album because this thing is, I'm just going to say it, fucking fantastic. I was late to the party on McKinley Dixon, much later than even you were, Jake. For My Mama came out in May of 2021. We completely missed the boat on it then. Finally playing catch up with how immaculately talented McKinley is. I was first really made aware of him with his feature on the closing track of Soul Glow's album Diaspora Problems last year, which is still one of my favorite albums of that year. And I was like, this guy has a great presence. I loved his verse on that track, and I knew I needed to check out his albums. So I fucking mainlined the last record, and I've completely delved into this new one as well, which is a tight 30 minutes, really sharp, really swift, really in and out, but also so full of potent lyricism and really hard-hitting emotional performances. It's a fun album as well. I think a little bit less heavy in terms of its themes in that last record, and a lot more kind of light on its feet. But man, there's some bangers on this thing. I just can't get enough of this thing. Jake, what are your thoughts?
As stated, last year at the very end of the year was the first time I heard For My Mama and Anyone Who Looked Like Her, and I pretty confidently asserted that that is my favorite hip-hop album of the decade so far, and that still absolutely stands. I go back to that album almost on a daily basis for songs that are absolutely riotous and how fun, colorful, big, lyrical they are. For My Mama is just, it is my platonic ideal of a masterpiece hip-hop album. It's very well-rounded. The lyricism is always on point. The flows are tight. McKinley's an amazing performer. He paints a very vivid portrait of his environment, his surroundings, the places he grew up in, and the dilemmas that he currently faces as a Black man in modern America, and the many struggles of things like intersectionality, all that kind of stuff. And he speaks about it with a very human level. And it helps that this album and the last one are sprinkled in with bits of things like neo soul and gospel that really feel like they add a vibrancy and a color and a definition to his sound that is basically irreplaceable. I think that you can compare him a lot to other contemporary rappers. I mean, the most commonly connected dot with him is Kendrick Lamar, and I do think it's because they have kind of a similar delivery style, and they're both just great all-rounders. So I was heavily anticipating Beloved Paradise Jazz, just because obviously with the follow-up to an incredible, masterful perfect record. It's always going to be interesting to see what he does, because that was where he really like caught on with people. Like a lot of people really liked that album. And so it really sort of, and he's been making music since 2016. So it really feels like this is where he gets the chance to prove himself, show everybody if he's got staying power. And I completely agree with Ryley. I absolutely love this album. And for many ways, I think it's a really smart creative direction for McKinley to go in that I was kind of worried that, like, again, you're following up a well-rounded masterpiece album. So if you go for that kind of general approach again, you really kind of run the risk of feeling artistically repetitive, or maybe treading old water, or just doing things that you've already done. And there's, very slim chance that you're going to be able to do it better, unless you're just, so incomparable that it's like unfathomable. So he takes a good approach here and basically makes what I would define as an extended coda to a lot of the themes on the last album, but is paradoxically, as he bills it, a kind of coming of age story within where he grew up. And it does actually have a pretty like streamlined, like emotional narrative to it for being, sub 30 minutes long. But the best thing about this is really just that all the songs proper on here are fucking fantastic. I've been following the singles as they've been released. Sun I Rise, it was like, I heard this and I was like, my doubt is assuaged. This is going to be amazing. The harmonic sort of vocal rises on here, the repeated hook of the Sana, it's so fantastic. A great way to sort of open this whole thing up. Run 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 is my favorite hip-hop song of the year so far, frankly. It is joyous, vibrant, but also like, an incredibly conscious and emotional song. But those little light, pianos, they're not kind of like glistening throughout this entire record. There's so much ornamental detail. McKinley's a dude who, I don't know exactly his process artistically, but in spirit, he reminds me a lot of Genesis Owusu, in that they both kind of try to harness this larger than life, bigger, like band proper sound to back up traditional jazz rap hip hop. That does give him a kind of like edge when it comes to scope. Like these songs sound big and expensive. Again, Live from the Kitchen Table is a song that's a little bit older that was reworked for here. Has a fantastic Gais Guevara feature, who is slowly becoming a phenomenal featured artist whenever he shows up on anything. And this album also manages to have really, hard-hitting emotional stuff on here, like Dedicated to Tarfeather is a moment that I feel like balances all of this album's strengths really solidly. And the ending is really uplifting. And I just, there's so much joy and love and passion here, and it's condensed into such a tight package that I really admire it. And it's also very distinctly not what the previous album was. It's taking ideas from that record, to be sure, but this feels like a very distinct experience that is worth going back to, worth dissecting. One of the best things about McKinley is just his lyricism and flows are super dense. I've come back to For My Mama so frequently, and I pick up on new details every single time I hear it. I suspect this will be no different. If you want to just give somebody a highlight reel of why McKinley Dixon is one of the most exciting voices in 2020's hip hop so far, this is a great way to do it, just because everything on here is staggering. It's not the kind of project that overwhelms me like something like For My Mama and inspires that level of passion, but it's not meant to. It's a different kind of record. And this just proves the fact that he's a versatile artist, and I will be continually watching everything he does for the rest of his career, because this is fantastic.
Yeah, co-sign completely. I've just been enjoying so much how light on its feet and bouncy and fun this record is, while kind of Trojan horsing some really kind of dark themes into it as well. I think that the more concise approach does wonders essentially for that atmosphere. It feels like a party record almost in certain respects, and I love that about it. Next up on our list is a band that we've never talked about before that I'm quite excited for us to give, obviously quite concise, but still talk about a little bit, which is the legendary art pop band Sparks. Sparks have been around for 50 plus years at this point. You may have seen Edgar Wright's brilliant documentary, which is essentially a 2-hour deep discog dive with a multi-$100,000 budget. That is a great overview of how eclectic and strange and crazy their career is. And the new album's called The Girl Is Crying in Her Latte. What's interesting about this narratively for Sparks is that it's the first album they've released since their kind of resurgence with the Edgar Wright documentary, and also with Leos Carax's Annette, which they of course wrote and composed the music for. Was kind of a huge deal that they had that wanting to make that film, wanting to make that musical for multiple decades, and finally getting to realize it. And now they're in the spotlight again after so many years, after decades of languishing since their prime. You know, Kate Blanchett in the music video for the title track on this album. And it's a very Sparks record through and through. It's filled with their kind of silliness, their absurdity, their very aloof take on sort of modern cultural concepts and commercialism and the nature of existence, all that fun stuff. But what's really, really satisfying about this is how immediate the grooves are, how fun and funny the songs are. I'm a huge fan of the bounce of second track, Veronica Lake, which has been stuck in my head very consistently ever since I first heard the album.
Veronica Lake.
Russell's vocal style is just irresistible to me. It's so silly. It's not really all that tuneful, except when it wants to be. And there's something kind of just tongue-in-cheek and kind of fuck you-ish about how kind of awkward they dare to be in the way they present their music. Like it's
very David Byrne.
Yeah, there's a kind of purposeful sort of like goofy disconnect in their presentation that kind of conflicts with what you would expect music to do. And yeah, so there is a bit of a Talking Heads-esque thing to that. But I mean, they were doing it since well before the Talking Heads were. So, you know, songs like Mona Lisa's Packing, Leaving Tonight, not that well defined. Take Me for a Ride. It doesn't have to be that way. You get that very goofy, very funny sensibility coming through, and it's just a great showcase of where Sparks are at. It's probably their 25th record or something ridiculous, so they're not necessarily doing a whole lot that you can't get elsewhere, but they do. It does feel modern. It does feel slick. It does feel like it gives you a nice way of checking in on where these prolific, legendary musicians are at and how little they have lost interest in creating for the sake of it, really.
I'm a bit of a Sparks newbie myself. I've only heard select songs. Basically, in doing research for my Susumu Hirasawa video, I noted that he was a big fan of Sparks and that you can point out particular stylistic similarities between the two of them, which become very abundantly clear upon listening to this album. So if anything, the biggest compliment I can give this is that it really further incentivizes me to listen to like more of their classic albums like Kimono My House, because I really, really enjoyed this. I had a lot of fun with it. It has a lot of minuscule issues for me that kind of compound it into being like, you know, if you looked at my rating for this, you might assume that I just kind of thought it was okay, but it's a really fun record. Like, it doesn't really like lose me ever. I will say that I do think that the part of it that is the most compelling to me is the front half, which is just kind of loaded with fantastic bangers. Like, I love the title track. Again, love Veronica Lake. Nothing is as good as they say it is. The Mona Lisa's Packing. You Were Meant for Me is also a really, really great song. I love how simultaneously irreverent, but still completely invested within their own narratives that they are. Like, Russell's singing voice on here, even when he's at his most comedic, it still feels like he's singing from the perspective of a character who really means what he says. There's nothing here that feels kind of half-baked. The only thing that I think really drags it down for me, other than the fact that it's just not as consistent for me in that back half. It's a lot of very good moments. Take Me for a Ride is kind of an exception. I do love that song. There are elements of the humor of this that really work for me. And then there are elements of the sort of satirical angle that they go for in their music, which is not my favorite thing in the world. A lot of it's done very tongue-in-cheek. A lot of it's done with self-awareness. But at the same time, that's kind of all the poignancy that has, because any observations or critiques that they're making about modern culture feel a little glib, frankly, a little bit like, yeah, okay. And I'm not saying that they could probably be self-consciously doing that, because, I mean, fuck's sake, look at the album name. A Girl Is Crying in Her Latte. They're obviously aware of this on some level, but I just feel like this embracing of one-dimensionality, no matter how self-aware or ironic they are, limits my ability to enjoy the record as much as I could, I feel.
It's a really fun update on Sparks and absolutely feels like their most essential record in some time as well. So it's nice to see them so creatively energized coming off the back of a net. Next up on our list, a very different band to Sparks. We're going to a classic Connecticut screamo band, one of the most legendary bands of that kind of screamo, power violence, emo wave that kind of happened in the late 90s, Jeromes Dream, who have a series of legendary EPs and splits in the late 90s, as well as the acknowledged screamo classic album Seeing Means More Than Safety in 2000. For a band like Jerome's Dream, and for any band in the screamo scene of that era, you know, that's about as much music as you could really be expected to make anyway. I mean, these bands were not built with longevity in mind.
Gospel type beat.
And also, if you listen to early Jerome's Dream, the performances on those albums of vocalist Jeff Smith, I mean, if you've heard any screamo, you'll know what a taxing and draining thing it must be to perform in that way. But Jeff Smith actually physically damaged his vocal cords from performing and doing those vocals live and on record as well. I mean, and they sound legitimately. It's actually hard to listen to early Jerome's Dream, or really any Jerome's Dream record, if you feel particularly sensitive about that sort of thing, because it's just, you can feel the pain that's being inflicted by this performance. So yeah, would not expect Jerome's Dream to have any kind of longevity. However, they did have a reunion in the late 2010s. Didn't really draw much attention. Fans weren't really a huge fan of their comeback album. But nevertheless, they're here again with a new album called The Grey In Between. This actually came out about a month ago, so it's a bit older than the other ones we're reviewing today. But I really wanted to talk about it because this, to me, is continuing in a trend of hardcore and metal and bands adjacent to that world making a comeback in the early 2020s that completely pushes them to the level of their best work again. This is an amazing album. I mean, now, to be fair, it's not an accessible record. You will enjoy this in as much as you enjoy noise rock and screamo music. It very much befits that aesthetic and doesn't do a lot to, veer from the template. But the coherence of the ideas here, the full commitment of the performance, and the just immense sound of these tracks completely pulls me through. This album is fan-fucking-tastic. It's only 24 minutes long, which honestly feels long even for them, but it sustains that runtime beautifully. These harsh, scraping, brutal, dissonant noise rock songs with incredible vocal performances and utterly devastating lyricism. It absolutely brings the band back to their peak, and I think, again, it's not an particularly comfortable listen if you're not super into this world of music already. But what I love about this is how it has this kind of modern aesthetic that totally makes it feel like an album that's come out in 2023 without capitulating in any way to that rawness that made them what they were when they first turned up. So I love this album. I think it's a complete standout in terms of hardcore records this year. Gets a strong recommendation from me.
Basically, cosign. I really enjoyed this album as well. Its slight runtime is both a strength and a weakness, though, for me. There are moments on here which are a little bit more transitional and a little bit less like fleshed out. They're like a minute, they're like 2 minute long, or like a almost a full 2 minutes on the case of the penultimate track. And because the album is so short, these moments kind of, they like, even though they're not long, they really halt the momentum of it. But as I listened to this more and more, it just kind of got easier to get over that. But I can't deny that if these things were removed and this was just like a concentrated 20-minute long burst of pure violence, then I would probably be a little bit more on board with it. But it's still a really great record. And I can imagine that a lot of, like the Gospel album last year, that a lot of longtime fans of this band are feeling particularly validated with this particularly striking comeback record.
Yeah, I mean, the first time I heard it, I was just completely taken with just how violent it is. It's so all-consuming. But coming back to it as well, I really started to appreciate, again, it's not necessarily doing anything to reinvent the wheel lyricism-wise, but there's some really evocative depictions of hopelessness and violence that befit the genre beautifully. I love South by Isolation, a huge standout for me. Lines like, the world keeps crushing us the way it takes us in. I've got to get away just to breathe. and then I'll know I'm safe to be me, and you say I'll be okay, and I am when we are, which is just a beautiful sentiment. And that juxtaposed as well with lyrics on songs like On Holiday with Infinity, like I once knew a guy who lit himself on fire. He took his pain and the pain of the world and lit a match. To watch him burn was a thing of beauty that I'd now like to forget. But I can't forget his heartbreak made our lives possible. You know? So you have it's right up there all the way. It's very heavy-handed. It's very just, but you know, that's what makes it what it is. That's what makes it so attractive to me. That's what makes me so
the emo and emo violence.
yeah. I mean, the final song ends with the lines, "She cried, we both died when they cut your throat, but I still had to be born." Like, come on, man.
It's very the band I thought the most when listening to this was actually Thursday, like particularly when they like really lean into their like harder edged stuff.
Yeah.
Just because there is kind of a like there is a atmosphere on this record for as like violent and aggro as it is. I still think that there's a lot of body to the production here. It's not quite as skeletal as you might expect, so that's also something that it does particularly well.
Yeah, like Jerome's Dreamer, to me, they're like the meeting point of Thursday and like Nails. Like they're just
Yeah.
bands. And I think that will appeal to a lot of people with particular aesthetic inclinations that might be similar to ours. Yeah. So we've had 3 very positive reviews now, 3 albums that we're all that we love very, very much. And now it's time to talk about one that we maybe don't care for all that much.
Get on the pain train, baby!
So Avenged Sevenfold are a band. Avenged Sevenfold are a California-based alternative metal, sort of melodic metalcore band. They've kind of been a bit of a whipping post. They're a relic of the 2000s sort of poppy metalcore shit heap that have just lingered like a parasite ever since. But I've always been intrigued by Avenged Sevenfold. I've always felt that perhaps this band might appeal to me in a certain sense because they seem to at least have a little bit more ambition than some of the more bog standard, really rote bands that approach that particular scene and kind of cashed in.
I call them the thinking man's 5-finger death punch.
Well, that's, you know, that I haven't heard that or those early records, but to me that sounds like what I was expecting. So this record, the new one, is called Life Is But a Dream. It's their first album since 2016's The Stage, which itself was a kind of comeback record for them. And it showcases a band doing things that I certainly was not expecting to hear from a band coming out of this metalcore sphere. I'm ill-equipped, though, to describe it. I'd love to leave it to you two, and then I'll offer my thoughts at the end.
Avenged Sevenfold are just about the easiest target in the world. This is because they suck. I wish I could put it a gentler way than that, but I can't really, and there's no point in pretending that I can. Everyone, well, mostly everyone involved is very musically competent. The interplay between, I hate that I don't have to look this up, but lead guitarist Sinister Gates and rhythm / sometimes lead also guitarist Zachy Vengeance has always been a shining point in the music that this band makes. They have a tendency to harmonize in really interesting ways, on top of just being really technically fluent guitar players.
Got to shout out bassist Johnny Christ and current drummer Brooks Wackerman.
That's just actually his name.
Yeah, that's really his name.
Brooks Wackerman is like if you asked J.K. Rowling to name a drummer.
Yeah, this band is such a distinct cringe relic of 2000s and early 2010s popular metal. And it was intriguing to see the reception of their last album, The Stage, in comparison to their previous works, because they always had some ambition. This was always evident on songs like A Little Piece of Heaven off of their self-titled, which sucks, but you know, at least it was something. You know, this was always a band that was never going to be content with just doing the sort of unga bunga chugging of the 5-finger death punches of the world. and that was at least commendable. That said, while Life is But a Dream definitely sounds like Avenged Sevenfold, mainly because the guy yowling all over it still sounds very much like M Shadows. How old are you now, dude? Like 45?
M. Night Shyamalan's younger brother.
Point is, this is an even further pivot away from their core sound than the stage was. And I have to say, the first time I heard the single We Love You, I didn't know whether to laugh or to cry. I mostly laughed. I will say this album's bad, and I could see thinking that this album is like nigh on unforgivably bad, but it's also too funny for me to hate. Like, what what is that vocal effect in the opening moments of We Love You? What are you doing? Like, I do admire the sort of Mike Patton-y energy of it, but it just you don't have the chops for this, guys. I think We Love You is the easy highlight of this album, almost if only for the comedic relief it provides amid the stretches of why would you ever do this. Think of pretty much the entirety of Mattel, and I have to maintain, because pretty much everything on this album is bad, that I do really admire the spirit of it. It's certainly the most interesting bad album that I've heard this year, for whatever that's worth. There's a full-fledged commitment to the bit here that is going to be genuinely challenging to Avenged Sevenfold's fan base.
Yeah, look, there are parts of this that I find admirable, and there are even a couple of things on here that I like, but never at any point is that not being detracted from by the vocal performance.
Uh-huh.
Like it is consistently, and okay, so there's musical ideas on here that are terrible, but for the most part, usually the thing that I'm enjoying least about this is what Mr. Shadows is doing most of the time.
And let the record show, always been a terrible vocalist, like very bad.
He's already dead, Morgan.
Yeah, well, I mean, just it is what it is, and I have to tell the truth. He sounds strained on here in a way that is honestly just depressing, and I don't know what to do with that. It's just like this album just bums me out. As often as it makes me laugh my ass off, there are going to be a lot of really interesting things said about it in the future, because it's like it appears to be genuinely divisive in a way that groups like Mr. Bungle aren't really, in terms of like reception. So yeah, it's interesting.
Spiritually, I agree with a lot of what Morgan says. If anything, I respect Avenged Sevenfold for willfully going against the grain. There are lots of metal bands like this who kind of popped up in the 2000s. They're probably a little bit, probably edgy enough to get people's attention, garner a pretty devoted teenage fan base and following. And let the record show, we are not, just because we're all kind of music snobs to some degree, doesn't mean that we all turn our noses up at stuff like this before. We've reviewed stuff like Linkin Park in the past, and we've, given albums like Meteora their laurels. Slipknot, also another band that's very much in that kind of edgier vein that we also really, really like. So I'm not trying to, like, I haven't also heard an Avenged Sevenfold album in full, and so that might limit my perspective here. And I do respect this band for going against the grain, doing something divisive, like Morgan said. There's a real ambition here in every element of this album's construction, from the writing being really high concept, story driven stuff, musical ideas that span the world of alternative metal all the way over to Daft Punk style electronic flourishes. And it takes balls is all I'm saying. And I know that the band, I'm pretty sure that this is to complete a record contract of some kind or some sort of deal, some kind of obligation, and they're taking advantage of that fact. And this all came from a creative period for which was born out of, you know, the mired year of 2020, so that they kind of channeled their creativity into this record. And I respect that, and I like that. And that is the only element of this album that I like in any way, shape, or form, is that in theory, it's appreciable. In execution, I fucking hate everything on here so much, man. I have not listened to an album this year that I've disliked more. And I hate saying that because I want bands like this to do stuff like this. I want them to be creative. I want them to be weird. More metal bands would be great if they took notes from Faith No More. But my God, Morgan wasn't fucking kidding when he said this album bums him the fuck out, because this bums me the fuck out, because I want to be like, yeah, you go, guys. Like, even if this isn't my speed, I'm still glad you did it. Everything fucking sucks. Lead vocalist sounds terrible. You've all made that point already, but my God, he's going for a Mike Patton style eccentricity, and he's trying to stretch his range across all of these songs. And he just sounds like he's borderline bedridden. Like, take a drink of water or something, dude. My God, he sounds so scratchy. They're not
dehydrated.
writing these songs around his limitations. They're writing them despite them. And I feel like a band like this reasonably could, because there is impressive musicianship on here. There are lots of, you know, guitar solos and stuff that are noticeably technical. And I don't like any of them because they're applied with this reckless abandon and lack of purpose that just, it's weightless. There's nothing here, even in its most muscular moments, that feels like it's grounded in anything. It's all elusive. I can't grab onto any idea on this record. And the production as a whole, just, it fucking bites, man. It's all blocky. It all sounds like shit. And whenever they get really ambitious with it, again, these songs that are very much in the spirit of things like Mr. Bungle and California, where they take on these ideas about like capitalism and modernity and the satirical approach to stuff like Mattel. First of all, it's so one-dimensional that it makes me think of the Ultramono from 2020, and it makes me like retch. Like, they're only doing most of these ideas because bands like Mr. Bungle have done them, not because they actually feel like a genuine artistic like drive towards it. They're just like, oh, Mr. Bungle songs are weird, so we're going to switch up all of the elements. And there's no thought to the construction of these besides being weird. And when they're all weird in the same way, they're not weird anymore. They're fucking boring, which is why this album is at its best when it just stops at the very fucking end of it. And the Life Is But a Dream is just the fucking piano outro. It's the best thing on here because it has the least to fuck up. Same thing with Death. It's just like it's a whatever song, like that G-O-D suite at the end, like the G and O for the ordinary. That's regrettable, to say the least. But there's songs on here where they take like this approach, like a soul going to hell that's experiencing the regret of his former life and trying to seek redemption, and it is executed in the most boring way imaginable. There is not a single second of this album that I find even remotely enjoyable, and I hate saying that because it just makes me seem like a hater that won't get on board with anything that a band like this would ever do. I like that it's divisive, but at the same time, it feels like a hollow shell of an actual creative statement. It feels like it's trying to be creative and trying to be bold, and it barely makes it out of the fucking gate before it trips and eats shit right in front of itself.
The most frustrating thing about this album is that I do genuinely see flashes of greatness on here. I think Cosmic's a great song. I really enjoy that track. I agree about the closing track. I think Life Is But a Dream is not just a nice piano outro, but it actually really thoughtfully well composed one. And then you have moments like, I don't know if I've ever heard anything more grating this whole year than the chainsaw guitar chug of Nobody. Like, what the
Oh, it's so Easily the worst song on this album. Awful. Every part of this song sounds wrong.
It's a
Ugh.
like it's I mean, I hate it, but it's a choice. Look, I do genuinely think that there's some interesting explorations on here. I don't think they quite have the finesse or maybe quite have the ability yet to kind of cohere the varying influences together the way that I think they want to. So that is ultimately the most frustrating thing about it to me. I think, again, some moments it comes through really, really nicely, like in Cosmic and like in Death as well, which is not as good, but I think has a sense of what it wants to be a little bit better than the songs immediately before it. And yeah, and then there are just moments that I do find really, really insufferable, like Mattel in Beautiful Morning. So it's in a weird place for me. I give it credit for what it wants to be, and I do think that I enjoyed this more than I expected to, which is to say, I don't like this very much, and I think it is a bad album, but I was expecting way worse. It's just one of those things where it's unfortunate because you want something with the level of ambition that it clearly does to realize its ideas better than it does, and it just doesn't quite get there. Moving along, because we did spend a little while on that one, I want to talk about the new album from a band called Sleep Token. Now,
Speaking of divisive,
well, I knew nothing about this band going in, and I got a sense that it was a big, slick, modern metal sounding sort of thing, and that was really all that I knew. I didn't even look at like the reviews or the Rate Your Music page or search the band at all when I listened to this. And it's got problems, for sure. There's aspects to what Sleep Token do that ultimately hold them back from being a great albums band, at least this far. I haven't heard their previous records, but at least off of the basis of this. They have an aesthetic template that is limited. But honestly, I enjoyed this. Mostly the first half of it, I will say, I think it does fall off a little bit from Are You Really Okay onwards. It comes back a little bit with the final two songs, but there's definitely a stretch there where the bare bones nature of the heavy chugging riffs and the earnest, very 2010s sort of Imagine Dragons adjacent vocal performance style does feel as though it grates a little bit. But honestly, for Chokehold through Vor, the first 5 songs on this record, I was enjoying myself. It was a kind of primitive enjoyment and a kind of enjoyment in spite of myself. I definitely got the feeling listening to this that this is the kind of band that I would have really loved when I was like 18 or 19 and super into like, Fueled by Raymond bands and 21 Pilots and that kind of thing and Hozier and all that sort of stuff. When I was in a particular sort of, era of my life that I definitely am far from now. And I had to like take a step back and say, you know what? I had to allow myself to enjoy the elements of this album that I really did enjoy, because there's a simple, straightforward, sugary joy to this. And I do think that it's well executed for what it is. It made me think of a lot of bands, like Imagine Dragons, which is like a lot of the kind of like pop rock, let's make something really, really loud and anthemic and shallow at the same time. And I was like, when I think about those bands and I think about the criticisms I would give to them, Sleep Token do a pretty good job of kind of addressing a lot of those. There's genuine weight to this music. I think it's really well produced. I think that there is even some of the strengths in the songwriting in the first half of the record as well. It does dip again with the song quality towards the end, but I found it to have a little bit more. Look, I enjoyed this more than I was expecting to. It's not a great record. It has significant problems. I think that the length of it, in combination with how sustained its decline is towards the end, really hobbles it in a way that kind of depressed me, honestly, because I wanted to really full-throatedly go in the paint for this. But I listened to it twice and I enjoyed it. And I thought that this is an example of a band doing something that, a style of modern, slicked, metal adjacent rock music that's widely mocked, but I think done here with a certain level of conviction and a certain level of musical confidence that I appreciate, because I don't get it all that often. It's entirely possible that my lack of expectation in combination with the shock that I got when I saw just how hated this album is has made me kind of more inclined to lean towards this. But hey, I thought this was decent.
That's partially the reason that I wanted to cover something like this to begin with, is because I actually find myself falling much closer to you than I do really most critics, because that's the thing, is that what initially led me to listen to this album, which I was familiar, I knew Sleep Token existed, I had heard some songs from them before, but they just were never a band that really gripped me. But I had seen overwhelming praise for this album from some critics, and the fan base of Sleep Token are really responding well to this album. They really like it, and every critic that isn't into this fucking hates it. It's a huge whipping boy of an album. So I was just kind of curious to be like, all right, where do I come down on this? Just because this is taking from a lot of metal influences that I personally dig. And, like, who am I to turn my nose up at more pop inclined metal stuff? I'm a Ghost fan, for fuck's sake. So listening to this was an illuminating experience because I basically understand every single perspective on it possible. On the one hand, you have the Sleep Token fans that this is pleasing, and it's not meant to be critical or snobby when I say this, but like, it's like the Avenged Sevenfold album, in that a lot of people who are gravitating towards this album, this is probably the first time they've been exposed to music that sounds anything like this. And that's not to downplay the quality or the competency of the musicians on display, but the cool thing about Sleep Token that I can at least say is that, yeah, this is a very trendy band with a very trendy sound. It's combining a lot of things together that is, very popular. And it's easy to turn your nose up at that. But at the same time, they blend so many things together that they're still kind of unique. Like, there are lots of people who would just be like, oh, everything sounds like this. But like, there's still nothing that combines the kind of weird R&B vocals, the gentler, heavy stuff, and more atmospheric parts, the poppy anthemic choruses and whatnot. Another band that this gets compared to a lot is actually Zealand Ardor. Not quite as extreme as that band, but certainly in the unconventional blend of very atmospheric metal and also, like blackened stuff and soul. So I get it. However, I just think that everything on this album is misapplied. There's a version of Sleep Token that exists that I feel like could be a great band. This version of it currently has a lot of problems. I don't like the album as much as you. I think the album is bad, but I'm much closer to where you and Morgan land down on the Avenged Sevenfold album with this, in that I still think that this is admirable. And yet what's frustrating is that I also find it really boring. Like, that second half, man, it's a slog. Like, it really is. The album runs out of its most compelling ideas very, very quickly. And this kind of sound that's supposed to be kind of all things to all people just bounces right off of me. And there are specific moments and instrumental ideas, particularly the utilization of trap style percussion, which is just, it's always funny. Like, every single time it happens, when those hi-hats start rattling, it's just like, what are you guys doing? Like, I get it. It's trendy. You want to combine all these. It never works. Like, it pops up on here and it's just like, this is completely antithetical to the atmosphere of this song. I have no idea why you're doing it. And that also kind of applies to the vocals, which, he's not a bad singer. He has a nice voice. I don't like listening to it. He does the singing in italics thing where he just over sings like everything.
Singing in italics is such a fucking great way of putting that.
It's because he like holds some of these notes and gets all lilty and willowy, and it's just like, all right, the melodrama is part of the experience. I get it, but also it becomes unbearably cloying. There are moments where the songwriting does kind of veer into so far into purple prose that it just does kind of have that kind of Deftones evocative, like, oh, okay, this kind of feels it. But also, when you look further into the songwriting, good God, some of this shit is like, again, it's very Imagine Dragons, but like in a way that's like laser focused on being like about relationships and love and heartbreak, but in a way that's just like so dollar store generic and being like, oh, my heart aches for you. It's just like there's nothing here that you're not going to get better anywhere else. And it's frustrating just because I can put this on and I don't necessarily have a bad time with it. It's just that when I isolate any particular element of it, of which there are many unique stuff, I'm just like, this needs to be tightened. This needs to be changed. This needs to be this way. And it's not me wanting something different out of this band. They're obviously going to have a ceiling with me, but I admire the approach, and I like that a band like Sleep Token is this popular, because 10 years ago, if you asked me that like this would be one of the most popular bands in alternative metal, I would have thought you a fool because it's too weird. But it applies its weirdness in such broad strokes that they cease to have definition. And that's just the unfortunate reality of it, is that there's a better version of this band lying within somewhere. I just don't think they've found that yet, and I'm not sure that they're the type of band that ever will. But if you like, I understand why people enjoy it at the same time. It's atmospheric. There's lots of heavier chugging riffs that I'm already kind of iffy on gent as it is. But again, there's a Deftonesy Koi no Yokon-esque quality to a lot of the stuff here that's initially pretty satisfying. You put this on in your car stereo, it probably goes hard enough for you to be like, yeah, I'm getting something out of this. But for me, it's just kind of a pale imitation of a lot of other things that I like a lot more.
Right, to change gear a little bit after talking about a couple of, a little bit of a mixed appeal in terms of metal, we're going to switch gears completely and move into well, I was going to say let's move into the pop realm, but we're not really moving into the pop realm. We're talking about an artist who's one of the most successful artists in pop of the sort of early 2010s period. She had a number of hits and a very complicated career arc that we didn't have the time to go into. But of course, I'm going to talk about Kesha, and we're going to talk about her new album, Gag Order, which by its very nature is such a strong departure from the various strengths that Kesha's carved out, both in sort of 2010s party pop music, but also in the kind of alternative country realm that she's come to occupy with her other more recent records. This cuts so differently from any of that stuff. And part of the reason is that conceptually, this record is a product of the ongoing brutal legal battle that Kesha is waging with Dr. Luke. And the core theme of this new album, Gag Order, is, as the title suggests, her inability to express herself in amongst all of this, because so much of the battle that she's fighting is surrounding her voice, is surrounding things that she's experienced, things that have happened to her, things that she is speaking up about, and has put her in a position where she is ironically unable to really talk about things, unable to really express herself in a public format. So you have this new album, Gag Order, which acts as a kind of therapeutic expulsion of these frustrations that Kesha's been experiencing. It's a team up with Rick Rubin, who is surprisingly well suited for this more withdrawn and pared back template that she's adopting here. There's a lot of minimal electronic instrumentation on this. There's a lot of stuff that focuses purely around vocal loops and what Kesha can do with her own voice in terms of anchoring a very minimalistic style. There is very little on this album that leaps out. There's very little on this album that does anything ostentatious that you might expect from Kesha. It's frankly quite a disquieting experience, but absolutely in a positive way from my perspective. Jake, what are your thoughts?
When I first heard this, there were kind of rumblings about this album when it first dropped, and people just being like, what the hell is this? And so when I first heard it, I had no idea what to think of it. And to some degree, I kind of still feel that way. It's just that I've refined what about this experience is compelling to me a little bit more as the days have gone on. Kesha is somebody who I feel like is probably one of our most interesting pop stars, just because her narrative and the breadth of her sound and styles is a lot wider than you would think the person who made songs like TikTok would be. And a lot of that does play into the narrative of her and Dr. Luke and her label, and just the general misogyny that was in the late 2000s and early 2010s that tended to discard people like Kesha as, just particularly nasty ways of viewing people like her. So now that she's taking this pivot into more creatively oriented music that feels like, not to demean her pop stuff or anything, but like this is stuff that feels so much more singular than even stuff like Rainbow did, which is sort of her comeback record, an album I enjoy a lot, by the way. But this album, there are lots of things about it that will not work for people. Every song on here doesn't really feel like a song. It feels like a shard of a song. It feels jagged and unformed and sometimes so minimal that there is no choice other than to feel deeply uncomfortable. Kesha's lyricism across this whole thing is very naked, very bare, very confrontational, and very vivid in its descriptions of self-hatred. And that kind of stuff it's difficult. And there's also, Kesha's grappling with her relationship with people who don't like her or her music, and takes a pretty mature perspective when it comes to that. And that, a lot of the ire directed at her and people like her and her art is, comes from an internalized misogyny that I think she acknowledges well on the track, where she does kind of, pay homage to her haters, but like in a way that's smart. And there's just a lot of ideas on here that feel bold. And the more I listened to it, the more I was able to enjoy just what an eccentric alt pop album this ended up being. There are genuine, like, loose cannon moments, like The Drama, which is just a fucking kaleidoscopic hodgepodge of ideas that should not work in any way, that eventually at the end interprets a Ramones song. It's wild. And I love it. Like, it is a deeply compelling experience that also does house some of Kesha's strengths, like on songs like Eat the Acid. Like, this song especially is like, it's drenched in this kind of minimal psychedelia, but that hook that she keeps coming back to on it is just fucking fantastic. She hammers these things over and over again. And like, each individual song on this album, I more or less like adore it. It's just such a fascinating experience to sit through. I don't really know how well it all comes together, and I feel like you have to really be invested in Kesha's narrative to fully appreciate what she's doing on here. Like, if you're not up to date with all that kind of stuff, a lot of this might bounce off of you, but I went in decently knowledgeable, and I came out quite satisfied. This is an album that I'm glad to see a lot of people are latching onto, just because it is so blanketly unfriendly and weird. Even people who want to appreciate Kesha for this more artistic direction, I could see that off-putting them. But I am ruthlessly compelled by basically everything on here.
Yeah, I mean, the people who are hearing this, I think, are appreciating it, but it is really underperforming. Like, this album just is not getting the exposure that it deserves. It's not getting the marketing. And I suppose that makes sense on a certain level because of the nature of what it is. But yeah, there's a beautiful directness to this. I mean, the moment that always charms me the most is in the next life I want to come back as a house cat part at the end.
Yeah.
The drama that's just like,
a house cat.
There's something so sweet and charming. It's not infantile. I don't want to use a word that's as condescending as that, but it's a kind of a moment of being so overwhelmed by the shitstorm that you're mired in that you just are able to step back. All right, last album we're going to talk about today, and we've saved a really special one for last. Jake, I know this is your favorite record of the ones we're talking about in this video, and it's one that, look, I came into this expecting to like this album a fair bit. The artist is Pupil Slicer. It's their new album, Blossom. It's a kind of mathcore, metalcore, just intense experience. But I was really stunned by a couple of core aspects of this album that I was not expecting, and ultimately how I came away feeling. But Jake, since this is an album that's compelled you so much, I want to hear from you first. What is it about this album that makes it work for you, and why do you think this is one of the best albums of the year?
So when this album came out, the night it came out, a lot of new music was dropping. So I had a full plate listening to a lot of new stuff. But what I wanted to do beforehand was acquaint myself with Pupil Slicer's first album, because I'd heard from people like Oliver of Deep Cuts that was a particularly great mathcore album. And we've talked about Pupil Slicer a little bit because they have featured on some Backwash songs. And if I may say so, they are absolutely a highlight of said Backwash songs. Like, Like, they are some of my favorite things that she's ever put out, in no small part due to those features. And us being the fans of extreme music and of mathcore that we are, this was a tantalizing prospect. So I listened to their first album, Mirrors, and was like, wow, yeah, this is fantastic. Really great nuts and bolts stuff that also blends mathcore with some alternative metal elements, a lot of industrial stuff. You can tell that this is a very Black Dresses adjacent band that is way more eclectic than maybe your run-of-the-mill extreme music bands. And it blended into something that felt really, really stark, really, really focused. And it felt like it had a uniqueness that I would attribute to being very much of the scene of like the modern mathcore bands, like Callous Dowboys' Celebrity Therapist, for instance. Very much in that same mold of being a really eccentric, interesting incarnation of its sound, but also feels like it could serve as a template for something greater. And that something greater is Blossom. From the get-go, this was a stunner for me. Like, I was absolutely over the moon about everything I was hearing. And it's not just because it's an exceptional mathcore album. It's because it's a whole lot of other shit too. Yes, mainly mathcore for sure, but there are elements of alt metal, black gaze, post-hardcore, prog metal even, all over this whole thing. And it's so eclectic that it manages to feel like the most successfully synthesized mathcore album since the Dillinger Escape Plan released their final album. And when it combines all of these things together, it will remind you of several different key points. There are some elements on here that reminded me of, say it with me, Death Heaven, which we're talking about this week because of Sunbather, because it goes for a more atmospheric, bigger sound, something that's less stripped back than the mathcore you might be used to. Because the production on this album is handled by one Mr. Lewis Johns, who I couldn't believe it was so easy for me to just be like, wow, I'm hearing a lot of different things I love about this band. And two of the most overriding influences I felt were Loath's album I Let It In, and it took everything, and Rollo Tomasi's album Time Will Die and Love Will Bury It. Two albums that I absolutely love, two albums this podcast absolutely loves. And he produced both of them. So it really just makes a whole lot of sense, because I looked that up and was like, oh, all right, so this was a conscious decision to go into this place on the band's part. And there's so much that makes this album unique. It's a narrative sci-fi concept album that's inspired by science fiction cinema, particularly science fiction video games like The Outer Wilds. Katie has directly cited several influences, and also mentioned that she works in tandem with the band's bassist, Luke Fabian, who also delivers phenomenal bass work across this entire album. Jesus fucking Christ. But Luke's tendencies lie more with traditional heavy music, whereas Katie is a little bit more, again, altered in that more modern, contemporary, Black Dresses-esque hardcore scene where everything's a bit more eclectic and blended together. And you feel the synthesis of that modernity and that classic stuff being put together and clashing and combining something with an alchemy that's so vibrant, so exciting, so cool. And it sustains throughout the entirety of this record. Like, from the moment Momentary Actuality pops in with just these disgusting riffs, and it just beats over and over again. And you've got Katie, who is one of the most compelling people in music right now, really leaning into the versatility of her delivery. She kind of leans on some of her screamed vocals, so leans on some of her more like feminine or androgynous vocal points during this album, and every single time it's spellbinding. On the closer here, she's like a dead ringer for a femme Greg Puciato. Like, there are certain hooks on the title track here, Blossom, that's just delivered with this intense charisma that I just love listening to. And throughout the whole album, there are breakdowns. There are thrash breakdowns at the end of some of these songs, like No Temple. There are doomier moments. There are elements of this album's writing that just really go for the throat. It's an impressionist narrative that's very like, I've been listening a lot to the Julie Christmas and Cult of Luna collaboration album this week, which is also a science fiction metal concept album that I've been listening to this as well. But this is way more esoteric. It's a little bit more the narrative's a bit more freeform, I guess is what I'm saying. It allows you to kind of seep into its cracks a little bit more easily. And it creates something that the more you uncover, the more you listen to this, the more you can kind of unfold it. And the more that the heavier moments really add something to this. But when it breaks away from that, it becomes something completely singular. My song of the year confidently, and that I can't imagine it being dethroned, is the penultimate track here, Dim Morning Light, which it bowled me over in the same way that Rollo Tomasi did when I first heard them, like that back-to-back combo of their like Churches-esque dream pop combined with a song like Alma Mater, which just absolutely slams into you. Like this song to me has the emotional tone of something like Dream House on Sunbather, where it's this liberating, like cascading, like these sparkling synths are in the background, this huge harmonious melody just comes in with the chorus, and then there's a key change on the third chorus repeat, which is so sinister feeling. It aches it out of you, and then it returns to the place in which it starts, and it makes it feel like it has this incredible arc. The entirety of Dim Morning Light is a melodic, cathartic ending, and then Blossom right after it is a rhythmic, cathartic ending. And I'm just enamored with it. Everything on this album is skyscraper levels of insanely great. I haven't enjoyed a mathcore album this much since somebody like the Dillinger Escape Plan put out an album. And honestly, the unique bent that this album has only just buoys it further. This feels like what should be a landmark release, both in mathcore, in queer music, in all this shit. It feels as titanic and as vital as something like that most recent Black Dresses album, which I think is maybe the best industrial rock album of the decade so far. And I would throw the same label to this. This is by far so far this year my album of the year, and I think that it is one of the year's first true brushes with perfection.
Wow. Is it dethroned Eve's Tumor even for you?
Yeah, it took a while, but Eve's Tumor is about uncovering the density of everything there, whereas this is more, there's so much more emotional immediacy and vitality to this album. That's not to denigrate the Eve's Tumor album, which also has amazing writing that I really resonate with, but this album just combines so many things about the aesthetic of heavy music that I find to be so captivating, and nobody else is doing it like them. Nobody.
You've described the music of this so beautifully that I feel a little need to continue to talk on that particular element of it. I mean, in terms of black metal or black gaze reference points, it may just be that we did a whole video on them fairly recently, but I thought a little bit of that Ultra Plagues album a little bit, listening to some of the harsher, more industrial timbres here, but of course influenced and fused with mathcore and very mathy metal adjacent tones, and beautiful and well synthesized and
hey, liturgy style breakbeat drums are on this album too, like later into album or songs like Terminal Lucidity, for instance, where I was just like, hey, love that shit.
What I want to talk about is thematically what stunned me about this album. So obviously it's an epic opera, it's got apocalyptic themes, and I was not expecting it to reference Outer Wilds, which I've never really talked about. I don't talk about video games that much because I don't presume to have a lot of knowledge. But, I've played a fair few in my time. Outer Wilds is my favorite video game. So I was not expecting that to come up here. And specifically, it's actually a reference to the DLC of that game, which explores some darker themes. And look, you mentioned this game to me. You bring up some of the themes of this game, which is one of the few pieces of art in my entire lifetime that has made me come to terms with my mortality in a way that's uplifting as opposed to crushing. You've got me on board straight away. I mean, there's direct lyrical allusions to that game here, but there's expansion of its themes into the particular struggles and suffering that Katie's experienced or that she wants to explore on this album that I found utterly just breathtaking. And yeah, this album is amazing. I'm completely on board with this. It is so assaultive, but so satisfying. It's so emotionally, it's just a complete, it's just so brutal to me. It hits me in so many of the same beats as the games and various pieces of fiction that it references and that it takes as jumping off points. And yeah, I think it's one of the year's absolute standouts in terms of hardcore music, in terms of metal, in terms of whatever umbrella you want to fit it under. It's obviously an essential piece of queer art this year as well, that we, of course, are the first people to champion ever as queer creators on this platform as well. I can't say enough good things about this. I am excited to let it ruin my life for the rest of this year, and I could not think of a better place for us to finish off our recap today. I'm sad that we didn't get a chance to like fully unpack this, but maybe we will in the future. I mean, it's certainly going to be an album that we talk about again come year-end list time, so it's never too late. But yeah, all we can say at the moment is that if you haven't heard this yet, go now,
Please
flee what you're doing and put this thing on and let it consume you. And if you have been enjoying it, then let us know what it means to you and let us know what you think of it as we continue to unpack it in our own personal lives and experience it, because it is a special thing. That brings us to the end of our roundup today. Let us know what you thought of any of the albums we discussed today. If you agreed with us or if you disagreed with us, if you have anything to add at all about your interpretations or thoughts on these records, let us know what we should be listening to as well. We're happy to do this kind of roundup again down the line in the future if
totally
stack up and there's things that we want to talk about in a little bit more of a capsule-like format. So let us know what you'd like to see. Let us know what you're listening to. We will add it to our playlists. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribing if you haven't already. Both those things help us out a lot. Appreciate all of you who have already done that. You guys are the best. If you want to go above and beyond and support us directly for just $1 a month, you can hit the join button, become a member of the Jams and Tea family, get your name in the title call of every video on this channel. Plus, if you want to recommend us some music to talk about and listen to, your recommendation will go to the top of the pile. Until next time though, folks, rock over London, rock on Chicago, American Express. Don't live life without it.